Greetings, fellow scientists. I'd like to welcome you all to the Wisconsin Science Festival online field trip. We're so excited to have you here today. We're going to be exploring things about electrons and oh my goodness, it's going to be really exciting. My name's Travis. I'm here with the Wisconsin Science Festival team, and we're going to have a special scientist guest, Jessica, that's going to lead us off and show her about her work for this field trip experience. So we're so excited to learn from Jessica about her science and what she does. How can you all participate today? Well, you'll notice at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you have a Q&A feature that will be enabled. We really want you to put your questions in. It's been going so fantastic hearing all the great questions. So as soon as you have a question, go ahead, type it in, and right away, and we'll ask that question for Jessica to connect to and talk about her science relative to your question. This field trip will be recorded, and as always, we ask that you do this in all activities that are part of the Wisconsin Science Festival with a responsible adult. We'd also like to thank all of our sponsors and partners that help make this Wisconsin Science Festival possible, and you can find out more activities and events to do during the festival at wisconsinsciencefest.org. With that, we're excited to get started and dive in with our scientist, Jessica. So take it away, Jessica.
Good morning. So I'm Jessica McChesney, and I want to tell you about my job, which is, I think, the coolest job that you could have. So I work at Argonne National Lab, and there I work at a user facility. And I get to do my own research and help scientists from all over the world and students come and do their research. And what I've done is I've helped build up this laboratory that you can see in the picture behind me. And what we do is scientists from all over the world come here and we look at the electronic properties of materials. And so you may have heard of a guy called Albert Einstein, and he actually won his Nobel Prize for what's known as the photoelectric effect. And that is when you shine light at a material, you get electricity. And what we do instead of measuring the electricity, we actually measure the electrons themselves. And those electrons that come with the light actually carry information about what they were like inside the material. And we can use that to study materials so that we can understand how they work and design materials to do what we want them to do. So the idea is that these materials are the things that will be batteries in your cell phones and iPads and computers one day. They'll be the interconnects or even the logic. And we also look at materials that will enable us to make new devices that we've just started dreaming about, like quantum computers and neuromorphic materials, where neuromorphic materials are materials that actually mimic how the human brain works. So I grew up in a very small town in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia, and I was always curious about how things worked, and I like to take things apart. And so I never really knew exactly what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I actually still don't really know, and that's the best part about my job, is that I get to do many different types of things. So I do science, I do a little bit of engineering, I'm always taking things apart and putting them back together. I get to do some computer programming, I write up papers, I interact with people from all over the world telling them about what research I do and learning what research they do. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
That's fantastic. That was really great to take a peek at your lab. We actually had a question from Lydia about the background now that we're kind of working in this different technologically infused world. So Lydia asks, am I correct in thinking, but that is a virtual background? So if it is, I know you mentioned that's a picture of your lab. Can you point out maybe a few things on that picture?
Sure. So Lydia, thank you for asking. Yeah, in the world that we're at, I do get to go to my lab, but right now we are limiting the number of people that go. And so behind me, you can see a big shiny dome that's covered in aluminum foil. And that's actually what we use to measure the electrons with. And if you notice, it's wrapped in aluminum foil. And the number one question I get when people come to visit is, why is it wrapped in foil? Well, electrons are very, very light. And if they, when they're traveling, scatter into anything, then they lose their energy and they lose their momentum, which is the direction that they're traveling and the speed at which they're traveling. And because we need to measure those properties, we need to limit the amount that they scatter. And so we actually, inside that big dome, we have vacuum, and that vacuum is better than what you get in the outer reaches of space. And so the electrons don't bounce off of air molecules.
Super cool. That's great. Noah has kind of a connected question here. You mentioned kind of how the laboratory is functioning a little differently. He's wanting to know, how do you still do your work during COVID?
Thanks, Noah. So actually, right now we have ramped up and our users are working virtually. So in the last 2 weeks, I've actually worked with 2 different user groups. One was at UW-Madison and the one was in Brazil. And so what they're able to do is they're able to log on and they can actually drive the experiment from home. And I come in and I am in their hands because we don't yet have robots to do everything. And so I come in and I mount their samples and I do all of the things that need to be done on site, and they can drive the experiment and get the data from their couches at home.
Wow. That is really interesting to be all across the world and having your lab be part of making those discoveries happen, whether they're on this continent or a different continent even. That's super cool. So we've got a couple of questions that I'm going to put out about things a little bit outside of science. Logan is wondering, what things do you like to do outside of the lab? And Cameron has a similar question related. It says, is there something is it something you love doing? How fun is your job? So a little bit like, the fun part about your job and maybe some things outside of your job for Cameron and Logan.
So Cameron and Logan, thanks. It's really important that you have a life-work balance. And that's one thing that's always a little bit challenging. Because I work at a 24/7 user facility, it's open all of the time. It means that I need to be very careful about balancing life and work. And right now I have a 4-year-old who can be pretty demanding in addition to the demands of the job. But it also means I have the flexibility that I can, compensate for some of that time. I used to say that my favorite hobby was collecting hobbies. And I've done everything from play ultimate frisbee to garden to bake. We just bought an old house. And so right now my hobby is really working on the house and raising my son.
Awesome. Fantastic. We've got some very specific questions that Walter is interested in on. He seems to be very interested about solar panels. So I'm going to read 2 of Walter's questions, and they relate to electricity. So Walter says, do you make solar panels out of different materials to see which ones produce the most electricity? And then a related question, if you were to throw a solar panel, kind of throw it at me, kind of maybe move it up in the air, would it collect more energy because of the friction in the air? So really, that I think that hint about the vacuum and how you can study things in a vacuum, would those electrons behave differently? Thanks, Walter. Well, let's hear from you, Jess.
So yeah, Walter, those are really interesting questions. So because I'm measuring the electrons that come off, solar panels aren't something that we actually really measure. It's not well matched because how a solar panel works is you shine light on it and it absorbs that light. And it doesn't actually, you have to shine pretty intense light in order to get electrical flow. But there are people at Argonne who do work on solar panels. They do some pretty interesting work. And similarly, because the way a solar panel gets energy is that what actually happens is it's similar process. The light shines and you get electrons, but because it's not a conducting material, those electrons and we call it a hole. It's the part of the material that's missing charge. What we do is we actually separate them from each other. And then that's how you get the current flow. And so it's not something I do, but it's something that I think is pretty interesting. And because that's the process of which you get energy, the friction that you would get, and you would get heating because of friction, isn't converted into electricity in a solar panel.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got some great questions coming in. Please continue to type those into the Q&A. and we'll get to all of them that we're able to today. We've got questions here from Caitlin and Armani, and they both want to know about how long you've been a scientist. How many years have you been doing this job? That was from Caitlin and Armani.
Thank you both. Longer than I'd like to admit. I don't believe I'm as old as I am. I graduated with my PhD from UW-Madison in 2004. And so I actually was really lucky. I did my undergraduate degree at West Virginia University. And I was really lucky that I got to get in a lab as an undergraduate. So I've been working in a laboratory since about 1997, I would say. So you can do the math.
That's great. I like the challenge. Emma is wondering, did anyone inspire you to be more interested in science? And as maybe a more difficult question, what's your favorite color?
That is a question I get from my son all of the time. What is my favorite color? And I like to tell him a different color on a different day. And I guess today is kind of a blue-green since I chose to wear a blue-green shirt. I answered the hard one first. What was the other one?
Yeah, you knocked that one out of the park there. So what was your kind of motivations, to get connected?
Yeah, so I've been really lucky and have had lots of great teachers and mentors along the way who've really kind of pushed me along. And like I said, I never knew exactly what I wanted to do. I have lots of interests, and lots of people think that scientists spend all their time in a laboratory with beakers and don't actually get to interact with people. And so I was really lucky that I got to get in a lab and I got to see that scientists do other things, and many will teach, but also do outreach with public. And I interact with people every day. I'm always training new users and collaborating. And so it's never been one specific. There's been lots of little pushes along the way. And like I said, I grew up in West Virginia and I ended up in Wisconsin because I had a professor who said he wouldn't write me recommendations unless I applied to his alma mater, which was UW.
Wow, that's pretty cool. There is some connections that are related to that question about, the preparation to be a scientist. And you mentioned a couple of other places you've stopped. So I'm just going to read out the names of these individuals and kind of summarize their questions. So Zina and Nola Armani, there's one other one there too. How many, what does it look like to become a scientist in terms of the classes and the universities that you have to take? Just a general description from your experience.
So in general, for most science degrees, you start out with the same basic core classes. You need to have a pretty solid math background because the language of science is math. The equations that we have are representations of how the world works, and we speak math to do that in most. Even in biology, there's a fair amount of math. On your day-to-day, it's a little bit different on what you do specifically, and there's a whole lot of overlap. And then, like I said, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so in the first couple of years for engineering and chemistry and physics, the coursework was pretty much the same, that you take the introductory courses and all of those. And then I got really lucky that I was able to get a summer internship in a lab, and I just kind of stayed, and it was super cool being able to get my hands on things and play with stuff.
Cool. So right now you've got a whole lab full of things, and Caitlin is wondering, a specific question is, how do you use X-rays in the lab?
So I like to say, so I work in a synchrotron, which is a giant ring. And so what we do is there's a whole team of scientists that their responsibility is to make electrons that travel near the speed of light. And when an electron travels near the speed of light and you accelerate it, so we do that by sending it around a curve, which is why I work in a giant donut. And you can kind of see that in the top. You can see that the wall looks like it's curved. It actually is, because the building has a 1.1 kilometer radius or circumference. And so those electrons travel near the speed of light, we accelerate them, and they give off the X-rays. And so the X-rays that we use here are much, much, much more intense than what you get, say, at the dentist, or if you go and get an X-ray, you know, because you have broken a bone. But they're also, the X-rays I use are much, much lower in energy. And we use X-rays because the wavelength of the X-rays is matched to the dimensions of an atom. It's the same reason they use X-rays actually to look at your bones, is you need something with a small wavelength so that it scatters off of your bones and teeth.
Cool. And then Zena, I think you brought up a question for Zena. Can you use a camera in a lab like yours, or would there be some sort of interference?
We use cameras all over the place. And now that we're in remote operations, it's even more so. So sometimes what we do, so in that big hemisphere that you see behind me, what we actually do is the electrons that hit the samples, they come off. They actually travel through that hemisphere where it selects the energy and the direction of the electrons that are coming off. And what I do is I hit what's called a phosphor screen. And so that's a material where you hit it with electrons and they light up. And then I just use a regular CCD camera, like the webcam that we're using for this, to measure the amount of light that comes off from that phosphor screen. We have other specialty cameras that actually measure the electron or the X-rays themselves, like the cameras you have at the dentist's.
That's super cool. So yeah, you'll see a little bit different kinds of details in the bone structure. You'll be looking at different materials besides for bones, which is most people's common experience with X-rays. That's neat. I like the analogy you made of a giant donut that you're sitting in. That's really cool.
Yeah, so you can actually fit 3 Lambeau fields inside the ring that is our building.
So that is a good 3 football Lambeau fields. That is really
3 Lambeaus. Yep.
All right. So Walter's wondering, electrons, are they electricity?
They are. So when we talk about current, current is the amount of electrical charge per unit time. So when you measure any current, like what's going through your light bulb or through any of your toys, then what you're measuring is the amount of electrons per time. So it is electricity.
And we've got lots of great science questions. Hopefully we can get to them all. Armani wonders, what type of precautions do you have to take when you're near the X-ray because of radiation?
So that's a really important question. And we actually have a science team that is responsible for making sure that we are safe. And so you can see in the picture behind me, let's see if I can point over there, that white wall. So that wall actually is about 1.5 feet thick, and it's made out of concrete that's been embedded with steel. And then it's covered in a sandwich of steel, lead, and steel that keeps any of the radiation from affecting us. So when I actually, if I was on site, I could be standing right where I am without any additional protection. And so the X-rays that we use are lower energy, and so just the stainless steel is enough to keep us safe. But the APS has 70 beam lines, so 70 pieces of equipment that look something similar to that, to measure all kinds of different things. And some of them use X-rays that are much, much higher in energy. And so they have hutches around their experiments like that to keep them safe.
Wow, that's really cool. I can't believe all of that's happening right in that background and in describing your lab. That's really neat. Ziana has a question about, what is the biggest project you've ever done?
So the biggest project is actually building that equipment behind me. So when I was hired, a team had already started designing, but it was only partially designed. And that was just an empty space on the floor. And so I was involved in designing some of the equipment, reviewing designs that other people did, and then helping to put it all together. And so this is at the end of what we call a beam line. So it's a tube in which the X-rays come down, and we measure the energy and we change the direction and we focus the X-rays along that beam line. And it's actually 6 school buses long. So there's a lot of equipment behind me that you aren't actually seeing.
Wow, that is a big project. So along that, that project, you have some electrons going, and Rowan has a great question related to that. How fast do the electrons go?
So the speed of light is 3 meters per second, 3 times 10 to the 6 meters per second squared. And I don't know that in miles an hour. And actually, I may have gotten that number wrong. We'll have to check the number. But the electrons are traveling at 60% of that speed.
Yeah, so 60% the speed of light, which is super fast.
Yes. And so we get them to go that fast by using magnets, because electrons have charge and magnetic field. So we have a bunch of electromagnets that they use to get the electrons going that fast.
That's great. Alyssa's wondering, you've mentioned a lot of amazing things, but Alyssa wants to know, what is your favorite thing to do in your job? And so I know that's a hard question, but maybe one of the favorite things.
My most favorite thing is meeting with the users. When we come up with the science plan and actually when they start to get the data coming, because for many of these people, they spend years getting their experiment ready, and they get to come and measure it. And so they're super excited. And so that excitement is really contagious.
So I know you mentioned previously this idea of a screen, a phosphorus screen, and Caitlin has a question about, why do you measure electrons, and what do you do with the energy that you collect there? So maybe, let's see if we can connect to Caitlin about some of those ideas.
So those are good questions, Caitlin. So the reason we measure the electrons is, you've heard of DNA, right? And so we know that we have genes and we have DNA. And if you measure the DNA sequence of something, then you know things about it, right? You may not know all of the properties, but you can predict what color hair someone has, what color eyes, how tall they'll be, if they're susceptible to diseases, and et cetera. Well, in material science, we have something called the band structure. And that's kind of like the DNA of a material. And so if I look at the band structure, I can see if something is going to be shiny, what color it's going to be, if it's going to conduct electricity, if it's going to be a material that doesn't conduct electricity very well, but could be a solar panel material. And so that's why we measure the electronic structure of these materials, so that we know why materials behave the way they do, and that helps other scientists design materials with the properties that we want. And these electrons actually have millivolts of energy. They're very, very small, because they have very, very small masses. And so the energy that I measure is pretty small. I actually have more energy from the motors that make my samples move up and down. Now there is a lot of energy in the X-ray beam. And so what we have is we have water-cooled stops that we use in the X-ray. If we had to collect, like if you have to stop the X-rays, you could melt something, they're so powerful. But what we do is we have very grazing, so it spreads out over a large area, and they're water-cooled. And so we just have a water circulation system that takes that energy as heat and takes it away.
Wow, there's so many pieces of science connecting there, from just, controlling the environment and keeping that experiment going with your cooling description, and and the sensitivity of your instruments to measure those things that are so tiny in a place that's so big is really cool. So Emma is asking, maybe, was there a time, like, when did you know you wanted to be a scientist?
So one of the things that's been really interesting about having kids is that you get to see kids, and babies from the moment they're born are natural scientists. They're curious about the world that we're in. And so every one of you is actually a scientist. Anytime you ask why or how, or you stop and think about it. And being a scientist doesn't just mean that you wear a lab coat and that you talk about something in specific. And I've just always been really curious, and that path took me to this particular job.
Wow, that's, yeah, I get you there. That's a really great description. Favorite classes in school, and Emma is wondering, maybe even, did you have a favorite class in elementary school, a favorite class in middle school, and or high school?
So I've always been a people person, and I would say my favorite classes for the most part are probably because of the teachers that I've had. And that's one of the things that I think is really important to help showcase, is that science isn't all about being books and being in a lab by yourself, that there's a lot of collaborative interaction. Math, for the most part, is something that always came easy to me, and I find that they're puzzles. My son is going to hate me when he's a middle schooler, and asking him math questions at the breakfast table isn't going to be fun for him anymore. But I like puzzles, and so any class that's like a puzzle has been probably one of my favorites.
Cool, and that's really neat. Yeah, puzzles, and thinking about like the puzzle of the lab, and then the people that you're connecting to, you've got to figure out their puzzles, so you have to learn their puzzles. Always something new. So looking forward to like the next week or so, the next month, maybe the next year. Caitlin's wondering, like, what's your main job in the lab? Can you describe kind of some things happening that way, and maybe like the time scale of some of the projects that you do?
So Caitlin, that's an important question. We always do our strategic planning in the today, this week, this year, 5 years, and 20 years. And so often you have to think about all of those. And it's really, really easy to get caught up in what's happening right now and today. But long term, so the APS is about to go through an upgrade, and we will be the brightest hard X-ray facility in the world, which is pretty exciting. And so right now, everybody is kind of gearing up and getting ready for that. And that's going to happen starting, or we're going to start taking stuff apart so we can build the new machine about next year. So the equipment you see behind me isn't what's going to change. What's going to change is what happens inside that shield wall that produces the X-rays. And so, yeah, life is really all about planning for all the different length scales of time.
Wow, that's super cool. It's great to hear too that you have such great teamwork happening, and you have to figure out how to work with people, not just within your lab in that place that you're sitting in, but also around the world. So, oh, it was a great session. And I want to let everybody know that we're so appreciative of those questions. And we want to thank everybody so much for joining us at the Wisconsin Science Festival. Thank you so much to our scientist, Jessica. That was a great tour and a great connection to what you do. And a recording of this field trip, it's going to be available, and we'll follow up with the teachers about that. Remember that the Wisconsin Science Festival continues with events hosted around the state, and you can participate in those. Just check them out at wisconsinsciencefest.org for more fun science. So we'll see you there. Get out there and do some science. Thanks so much.